brought a 20-year-old girl to live with us. I accepted in silence. A week later, she found out that the assets he had promised her were already all in my name. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The front door opened, and there she stood. Avalon. All 20 years of her, with gleaming auburn hair cascading down her shoulders and eyes that sparkled with youth and ambition. My husband Brent, 67 years old, with more gray than brown in his hair, these days stood beside her, his hand placed possessively on the small of her back. "Myrtle," he said, clearing his throat. "This is Avalon. She'll be staying with us for a while." I stood frozen in our living room, dish rag still in hand from dusting the shelves Brent had insisted needed cleaning before this special guest arrived. Now I understood why. "Nice to meet you," I managed, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Avalon gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Brent has told me so much about you." I doubted that very much. Later that night, as I prepared dinner, Brent's favorite pot roast that he'd specially requested, I overheard them in the study. Their voices carried through the heating vent that connected to the kitchen, a quirk of our old house that Brent had forgotten about years ago. "She seems nice," Avalon said, her tone suggesting anything but. "Myrtle? Yes, she's harmless. Keeps to herself mostly," Brent replied. "Don't worry about her. She'll adjust." Adjust. As if I were an old piece of furniture that needed to be moved to make room for something new and shiny. I set the table for 3, using the good china we normally reserved for holidays. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the silverware. 42 years of marriage, and Brent had never once mentioned wanting someone else in our lives. We'd built everything together from nothing. The small accounting practice that grew into a successful firm. The cozy 2-bedroom starter home that eventually became this sprawling 4-bedroom house in the best neighborhood in town. Dinners. "Ready," I called out, hating how timid my voice sounded. They emerged from the study, laughing about something private. Brent pulled out Avalon's chair, my chair, where I'd sat for decades, and guided her into it. I took the seat across from them, feeling like a guest in my own home. "This looks wonderful, Mrs. Collins," Avalon said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Please, call me Myrtle," I replied automatically, the social graces of a lifetime kicking in despite everything. "Myrtle makes the best pot roast in the county," Brent boasted, as if showcasing one of my few remaining valuable qualities. The evening progressed in a blur of polite conversation and mounting dread. Avalon was studying business, she explained. She had met Brent when he gave a guest lecture at her college. He had been so inspiring that she'd approached him afterward for mentorship. Mentorship. Is that what they were calling it these days? That night, Brent slept in the guest bedroom, claiming he didn't want to wake me with his late-night reading. I lay awake in our marriage bed, alone, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd arrived at this moment. Had there been signs I'd missed? Had I been so consumed with maintaining our home, supporting his career, and building our life together that I'd failed to notice him slipping away? The next morning, I found Brent and Avalon at the breakfast table, heads bent close together, over coffee. They straightened when I entered. "Myrtle," Brent said, his voice carrying an authoritative tone I hadn't heard since the early days of our marriage. "Avalon will be staying indefinitely. I'd like you to make up the blue bedroom for her." The blue bedroom, our daughter's old room, before she moved across the country. The room I'd preserved with all her childhood memories. "But I know," he cut me off. "It's time to clear it out anyway. Sarah hasn't used it in years." I nodded mutely and turned away, not wanting them to see the tears threatening to spill. "And Myrtle," Brent added, "we'll need to rearrange a few things around here. Avalon has some wonderful ideas for modernizing the place." As I climbed the stairs to begin dismantling my daughter's room, I heard Avalon's voice, low and intimate. How soon can we start looking at those investment portfolios you mentioned? I have so many ideas for your retirement planning. Soon, Brent replied. I just need to sort out a few details first. That evening, while carrying a basket of laundry past Brent's home office, I overheard him on the phone. Yes, everything's going according to plan, he was saying. Myrtle doesn't suspect a thing. Once I move everything over, we'll be set. I nearly dropped the basket. Move everything over? What was he planning? That night, I waited until Brent was asleep in the guest room and crept into his office. I needed to understand what was happening. What I found in his email made my blood run cold. Messages between him and Avalon dating back months, plans for their future together, and worst of all, his promises to her about their financial security, the money and property we had built together over 4 decades of marriage. Little did they know, 5 years ago during a tax audit, Brent had transferred everything into my name as a protective measure. A detail he seemed to have conveniently forgotten in his infatuation with youth. I closed his laptop and returned to our bedroom. For the first time since Avalon's arrival, I felt something other than shock and heartbreak. I felt power. It took 3 days to clear out Sarah's room. Each childhood memento I packed away felt like burying a piece of my heart. Avalon watched from the doorway on the final day, her arms crossed as I carefully placed the last of Sarah's books into storage boxes. You don't need to keep all that. You know, she said, studying her manicured nails. Brent says you're too sentimental about things. It holds you back. I didn't respond, just continued methodically wrapping Sarah's high school debate trophies in newspaper. I've been thinking mint green for the walls, Avalon continued, stepping into the room uninvited. Much fresher than this childish blue. And that old dresser needs to go. The dresser Brent had refinished when Sarah turned 13. The one with her growth marks penciled on the inside of the drawer. Brent has given me a budget for redecorating, she added, her voice honey-sweet with triumph. He wants me to feel at home here. Home. This was my home. I'd scrubbed every inch of its floors, painted every wall, tended every flower in the garden outside. Yet now I was being treated like an inconvenient housekeeper. That evening, Brent announced we were having dinner guests, his newest clients, a wealthy couple looking for investment advice. I'll need you to prepare something impressive, Myrtle, he said, not looking up from his phone. Avalon will help you plan the menu. Actually, Avalon interjected, I was thinking we could cater. Myrtle's cooking is traditional, but these clients are more the gourmet type. Brent nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Good thinking. Order whatever you think is best. My pot roast wasn't good enough anymore. Neither were the dinner parties. I'd hosted for decades, events that had helped Brent secure countless business relationships. The dinner was a performance I watched from the sidelines. Avalon played hostess in my dining room, serving food I had paid for on my china. She laughed at all the right moments, touched Brent's arm intimately, and spoke with authority about investment strategies she'd clearly rehearsed. Myrtle has been such a wonderful support, she told the guests when I brought in coffee. It's so important for Brent to have that stability at home while he focuses on expanding the business. Expanding the business. At 67, Brent had been talking about scaling back, not expansion. What game were they playing? After the guests left, I began clearing the table while Brent and Avalon lingered over wine. That went perfectly, Avalon said, clinking her glass against his. They'll definitely transfer their portfolio to us now. Us. As if she were already his business partner. Couldn't have done it without you, Brent replied, his voice warm with admiration, the tone he'd once used with me decades ago. I was thinking, Avalon continued, lowering her voice slightly, we should start looking at those vacation properties we discussed. The market in Florida is perfect right now. Florida. Brent had always insisted he would never retire to Florida. Too humid, he'd complained whenever I'd suggested it. Soon, he promised her. Just need to liquidate some assets first. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those assets he planned to liquidate. Our assets, built from 42. Years of shared sacrifice and hard work. The next morning, while Brent was in the shower, I accessed our safe. Inside was a folder containing all our important documents: property deeds, investment accounts, insurance policies. I spread them across our bed, confirming what I already knew. Everything: the house, the business, the investment portfolios, even the cabin by the lake, all legally in my name. 5 years ago, when Brent faced a potential lawsuit from a disgruntled client, our lawyer had suggested transferring everything to my name as protection. Brent had agreed without hesitation, signing the papers while joking, "It's all yours anyway if I drop dead first." Now I wondered if he remembered that conversation at all. I carefully returned the documents to the safe, locking away my newfound security along with them. For the first time since Avalon's arrival, I felt the knot in my stomach loosen slightly. They could plot and plan all they wanted, but the foundation they were building their dreams on was legally mine. The next week brought more changes. Avalon began redecorating the living room without asking me, replacing family photos with modern art prints. She moved my reading chair, the one by the window where I'd spent countless evenings, to make room for an expensive exercise bike she had delivered. "We need to modernize this place," she told me when I found her rearranging my kitchen cabinets. "Brent says everything here is stuck in the past, just like—" She stopped herself, but her meaning was clear. Just like me. I said nothing, just nodded and continued preparing dinner. Let them think I was weak, confused, beaten down. Let them believe I had no fight left in me. Every evening, I endured their intimate conversations, their not-so-subtle hints about my obsolescence in my own home. Brent began criticizing things he'd never mentioned before. My clothes, my hairstyle, the way I folded his shirts. "You could learn a thing or two from Avalon," he said one evening as she sauntered into the room wearing an outfit that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. "She understands the importance of appearances in the business world. I had helped build that business, had worn sensible clothes and practical shoes while working alongside him in those early days, answering phones and balancing books when we couldn't afford staff. But those memories seemed to have faded for Brent, replaced by the allure of Avalon's youth and ambition. One afternoon, I overheard them in the study again, their voices slightly raised. "I don't understand the delay," Avalon was saying, an edge to her voice I hadn't heard before. "You promised me we'd start moving things by now." "These things take time," Brent replied, sounding defensive. "The accounts are complicated. There are tax implications." "Tax implications?" Avalon's voice sharpened. "Or is it that you're stalling? Is Myrtle becoming a problem?" No, Brent assured her quickly. "Myrtle doesn't question anything. Never has. She trusts me completely." I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a bitter laugh. He was right about one thing. I had never questioned him. I had trusted him completely. But that trust had died the moment he'd brought Avalon through our front door. That evening, Brent announced his plans to modernize our home. New furniture, new appliances, even knocking down walls to create an open-concept space. "Avalon has wonderful ideas for bringing this old place into the 21st century," he said, beaming at her. "We'll start with the master bedroom." Our bedroom. The room where we'd slept together for 42 years, where we'd made love, argued, reconciled, shared dreams, and weathered losses. "Whatever you think is best," I said quietly, noting how Brent's expression shifted briefly, relief mixed with a touch of confusion at my continued compliance. As I cleared the dishes that night, I heard Avalon's voice from the living room. "How soon can we look at those investment accounts? I have some ideas for restructuring." Soon, I thought to myself as I dried the wine glasses, sooner than either of you expect. 3 weeks into Avalon's stay, I had perfected the art of invisibility. I moved through my own home like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, agreeing to everything, and keeping my true thoughts locked safely behind a mask of resignation. All the while I was watching, listening, and planning. I started taking afternoon walks, something I'd never done before. Brent and Avalon didn't question it. They seemed relieved to have me out of the house. Little did they know these walks took me to Eleanor Peterson's office. Eleanor had been my friend since college, before I'd even met Brent. She was also one of the best divorce attorneys in the county. "This is clear-cut elder abuse, Myrtle," Eleanor said during our third meeting, her voice tight with controlled anger as she reviewed the notes I'd been keeping. "Emotional manipulation, isolation, financial exploitation. But he hasn't actually taken anything yet," I pointed out. "He can't. Everything's in my name." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Which he's forgotten. But what happens when he remembers? Or when he tries to force you to sign things over?" I hadn't considered that possibility. The thought of Brent pressuring me to sign documents sent a chill through me. "Document everything," Eleanor advised, sliding a small notebook across her desk. "Times, dates, conversations. Take photos of any changes they make to the house. Forward me any emails or texts. And Myrtle," she added, her voice softening, "be careful." At home, I maintained my performance of docile acceptance. I prepared meals that went unappreciated, cleaned spaces that Avalon would immediately rearrange, and pretended not to notice when family heirlooms disappeared, replaced by modern decor that Avalon insisted was more now. "We need to talk about the lake cabin," Brent announced one evening in late September. We were having dinner, or rather, they were having dinner while I ate a small portion at the far end of the table. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Avalon thinks we should sell it," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Use the money for some investments she's been researching. The cabin had been our refuge for 30 years. We'd built it ourselves, spending weekends hammering nails and varnishing floors. Our daughter had learned to swim in that lake. I had scattered my parents' ashes along the shore. "If you think that's best," I said, focusing on cutting my chicken into perfectly even pieces. "See?" Brent turned to Avalon triumphantly. "I told you she'd understand." Avalon shot me a look of mixed suspicion and satisfaction. "The property values in that area have tripled. It's just sitting there empty most of the year. It makes financial sense." Financial sense. As if that cabin could be reduced to dollars and square footage. Later that night, I stood at the bedroom window, watching a sudden autumn storm lash the maple tree in our yard, the tree Brent and I had planted the day we moved in. Lightning illuminated the yard in brief, harsh flashes, and I found myself remembering a different storm, decades ago, when we'd huddled together under blankets during a power outage, planning our future by candlelight. Where had that man gone? When had he transformed from my partner into this stranger who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience? The next morning, I found them huddled over coffee and real estate listings. "The cabin should fetch at least $400,000, Avalon was saying, her finger tracing figures on a spreadsheet. "That gives us enough to start the portfolio restructuring and put a down payment on that condo in Naples." "Naples?" I couldn't help interrupting. "Florida?" They both looked up, startled, as if they'd forgotten I was still there. "Just exploring options," Brent said smoothly. "For the future." "Our future," Avalon added, her emphasis subtle but unmistakable. I nodded and continued to the kitchen, my hands shaking slightly as I filled my coffee cup. Through the serving hatch, I could hear them continuing their conversation in lowered voices. "She's getting suspicious," Avalon murmured. "We need to move faster." "I told you, these things take time," Brent replied, a note of frustration in his voice. "The cabin deed is. Complicated. Complicated because it was solely in my name. A gift from Brent on our 30th anniversary to protect it from any business liabilities. That afternoon, I called Sarah for our weekly chat. I hadn't told her about Avalon yet. Some part of me couldn't bear to shatter her image of her father or admit how quickly my life had unraveled. "You sound different, Mom," Sarah said, her voice concerned despite the thousands of miles between us. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," I lied. "Your father's been busy with work." "At his age?" I thought he was slowing down. I changed the subject, asking about her children, my grandchildren who lived too far away to visit regularly. As we talked, I felt a resolve hardening within me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Sarah, about her children, about the legacy Brent and I had built together that he now seemed willing to throw away for a girl younger than our daughter. After hanging up, I returned to the safe and retrieved my folder of documents again. This time, I made copies of everything, storing the originals in a safety deposit box I opened at a different bank than the one Brent used. I added our marriage certificate, birth certificates, tax returns, anything that established our long history together and our joint contributions to what was now legally mine. As I locked the safe, I heard Avalon's voice from downstairs. "When do I get to meet with your financial advisor?" "You promised I could sit in on the next meeting." "Soon," Brent replied, that same word he'd been repeating for weeks now. "Just need to prepare him first. Walter's a bit old-fashioned." Walter Schmidt had been managing our investments for 15 years. He'd attended our anniversary parties, sent Christmas cards, watched our family grow. Old-fashioned indeed. That night, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the guest bedroom where I now slept. Brent had taken back the master bedroom, claiming he needed the attached office space for late-night work. More likely, he needed privacy for his late-night conversations with Avalon, whose bedroom was conveniently adjacent. I thought about the life we'd built, the memories embedded in every corner of this house, and the casual cruelty with which Brent was erasing them, erasing me. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm me again. But beneath the grief, something else was growing. A steady, cold determination. Let them make their plans. Let them think I was a feeble old woman too beaten down to fight back. Their arrogance would be their downfall. In the darkness, I allowed myself a small smile. They had no idea what was coming. The tension in the house grew thicker as October arrived. Avalon had stopped pretending to be nice to me when Brent wasn't around. Her true colors emerged in snippy comments, in the way she'd accidentally knock over my things, in her demands disguised as requests. "Myrtle, be a dear and wash my cashmere sweaters," she'd say, dropping an armful of expensive clothes at my feet. "They need special handling." I did the laundry, carefully following the care instructions. I cooked their meals, cleaned their messes, and maintained my facade of quiet acceptance. All the while, I continued my afternoon walks to Eleanor's office, documenting every slight, every conversation about their future plans for my property. "You're building an airtight case," Eleanor assured me, reviewing my latest notes. "But we need to be patient. Let them make the first move." Patience had never been my strong suit, but I was learning. I'd waited 42 years for my husband to reveal his true character. I could wait a little longer for him to face the consequences. The catalyst came on a rainy Tuesday. I was upstairs putting away laundry when I heard Avalon's voice from Brent's study, sharp with frustration. "I don't understand why we're waiting. You promised me we'd start moving assets by now." "It's complicated," Brent replied, his voice strained. "There are legal considerations." "Legal considerations?" Avalon's voice rose. "Or are you having second thoughts? Because I've put everything on hold for this, Brent. I turned down other opportunities to be with you. Other opportunities. Other old men with money, no doubt. I know, sweetheart, I know. Brent's tone was placating. Look, we have that meeting with Walter on Friday. We'll start the process then. The whole process? Including the house? Yes. Everything. I promise. Once we explain the situation, he'll help us restructure everything into our names. Our names. Not his and mine, but his and Avalon's. I gripped the doorframe, steadying myself. So that was their plan, to confront Walter together, to pressure him into helping them transfer my assets. Little did they know Walter had been one of my first calls after discovering Brent's betrayal. He was already prepared. The next morning, Brent announced he was taking Avalon shopping for something suitable to wear to the meeting with Walter. Financial advisors appreciate professionalism, he told her over breakfast, as if I weren't sitting right there, as if I hadn't attended hundreds of financial meetings throughout our marriage. I was thinking that St. John's suit we saw online, Avalon replied, scrolling through her phone. The navy one with the gold buttons? Perfect, Brent agreed, his eyes crinkling with affection, the same expression he'd once reserved for me. After they left, I called Walter directly. They're coming in on Friday, I told him. Brent thinks you're going to help him transfer everything to him and Avalon. Walter's sigh crackled through the phone. I've known you both for 15 years, Myrtle. I never thought Brent would. He trailed off, professional discretion preventing him from voicing his true thoughts. Neither did I said simply. But here we are. I'll follow the plan we discussed, Walter assured me. Just be prepared for fallout. I hung up, a strange calm settling over me. After nearly a month of playing the docile wife, of swallowing, my pride in biding my time, the end was finally in sight. When Brent and Avalon returned, she was carrying multiple shopping bags from high-end stores. They were laughing, caught up in their own world, until they spotted me sitting quietly in the living room. Myrtle, Brent said, his smile fading slightly. I thought you'd be out on your walk. It's raining, I replied, gesturing toward the window where droplets streaked the glass. Right, he said, looking uncomfortable. Well, we've had a productive afternoon. I can see that, I said, eyeing the shopping bags. How many thousands of dollars had he spent on her today? Money from our joint accounts. Money we'd saved together over decades of careful planning. Avalon smirked and deliberately leaned against Brent, a casual intimacy meant to wound me. Brent has excellent taste, she said, her eyes challenging mine. Yes, I agreed mildly. He always did like shiny new things. Her smile faltered just slightly. For the first time, I deviated from my script of meek compliance. That night, the house hummed with anticipation. Brent was unusually attentive at dinner, complimenting my cooking, asking about my day. Performances meant to soothe his conscience, perhaps, before Friday's betrayal. Avalon watched his solicitousness with thinly veiled impatience. Twice, I caught her checking her watch, as if counting down the hours until I became irrelevant. I was thinking, Brent said as I cleared the dinner dishes, we should have Walter over for dinner soon, after the meeting on Friday, to celebrate our new financial direction. That sounds lovely, I said, the lie smooth on my tongue. I could make his favorite beef Wellington. Excellent, Brent beamed, pleased by my continued cooperation. See, Avalon? I told you Myrtle would understand once everything was explained. Properly. The next day passed in a haze of nervous energy. Brent spent hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't quite make out. Avalon tried on her new suit 3 times, preening before the mirror, practicing what she called her professional smile. I maintained my routines, secretly gathering the final pieces of evidence Eleanor had requested. I made copies of credit, card statements showing Brent's recent extravagant spending on Avalon. I photographed the changes they'd made to the house, my house. I recorded a conversation where they discussed phasing me out of financial decisions. By Thursday evening, they could barely contain their excitement. The facade of normalcy had slipped, revealing their true intentions. "This time tomorrow," Avalon said, raising her wine glass in a private toast with Brent. "We'll be on our way." "To the future," Brent replied, clinking his glass against hers. Slipped away to bed early, unable to stomach watching their celebration. In the guest bedroom, the room that had once been my sewing room before Avalon decided it should be converted into a proper guest suite, I sat by the window and watched the stars emerge. 42 years of memories played through my mind. Brent and me as newlyweds in our first apartment, painting the walls together, bringing Sarah home from the hospital, summer barbecues and winter holidays, the quiet comfort of growing old together, or so I had thought. How had we come to this? When had his love curdled into such contempt that he could replace me so easily, discard me so carelessly? The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what happened next. Friday morning dawned bright and clear. Brent was up early, humming in the shower. Avalon spent an hour on her makeup, emerging from her room looking polished and determined in her expensive new suit. "We should leave in 20 minutes, Brent announced, checking his Rolex, an anniversary gift from me, years ago. "Walter appreciates punctuality." "Of course," Avalon agreed, smoothing her skirt. "First impressions are everything." I busied myself, in the kitchen, avoiding their eyes. Let them believe I was oblivious. Let them think this was just another day. As they prepared to leave, Brent paused at the kitchen doorway. For a moment, something like guilt flickered across his face. "We'll talk when I get home, Myrtle," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in weeks. "About the future, about arrangements." Arrangements. As if I were a piece of furniture to be relocated. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The front door closed behind them. I watched through the window as they got into Brent's Mercedes, Avalon in the passenger seat where I had sat for decades. They pulled out of the driveway, headed toward Walter's office and their moment of reckoning. I picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor. "They're on their way," I said quietly. "It's time." I spent the next 2 hours in a state of suspended animation, moving through the house like a ghost in my own life. I straightened picture frames that Avalon had deliberately tilted. I watered houseplants she'd neglected. I reclaimed small territories in this battlefield that had once been my home. The grandfather. Clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from my parents, chimed 11 times. By now, they would be sitting in Walter's office. By now, they would know. I imagined the scene, Walter's carefully neutral expression as Brent explained their restructuring plans, Avalon's confident smile slowly fading as Walter reviewed the documentation. The moment of realization when Brent discovered that his castle was built on sand, that legally he had no authority to transfer anything. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Eleanor's name flashed on the caller ID. "They just left Walter's office," she said without preamble. Brent looked like he'd seen a ghost. The girl was practically running to keep up with him. "They're heading your way." My heart pounded against my ribs. "What happened?" Walter called me right after. He said Brent demanded to transfer the investment accounts into joint ownership with Avalon. When Walter explained that wasn't possible because everything was solely in your name, Brent insisted there must be some mistake. Eleanor's voice held a note of grim satisfaction. There was no mistake, of course. Walter showed him the paperwork. Brent's own signature on the transfer documents from 5 years ago. I sank into a chair, legs suddenly weak. And Avalon? According to Walter, she turned white as a sheet, started demanding to see proof. When Walter pulled out the documents, she stormed out. Brent followed her, trying to explain. I thanked Eleanor and hung up just as the sound of tires on gravel announced their return. I moved to the living room window and watched as Brent's Mercedes screeched to a halt in the driveway. Avalon emerged first, slamming the door so hard the car shook. Her perfect composure had shattered. Her face was contorted with rage as she shouted at Brent across the car's roof. I couldn't hear her, words through the closed windows, but her fury was unmistakable. Brent's shoulders were hunched, his hands raised in placation as he followed her toward the house. I settled myself in the armchair by the fireplace, my chair, the one Avalon had tried to banish to the basement. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The front door burst open. Avalon stormed in, her expensive heels stabbing the hardwood floors I'd polished for decades. She stopped short when she saw me sitting there, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You," she hissed, her voice vibrating, with rage. "You knew all along." I said nothing, just held her gaze steadily. Brent appeared behind her, his face ashen. "Myrtle, I can explain." "Explain what?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. "How you plan to throw away 42 years of marriage? How you brought this girl into our home and expected me to serve her? Or how you forgot that everything we built together is legally in my name?" Avalon whirled on Brent. "You told me everything was yours. You said we just needed to transfer it." "I thought it was," Brent protested, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The transfer was just a formality for tax purposes. I never thought—" "That's right," I cut in. "You never thought. You never thought I'd find out about your plans. You never thought I'd stand up for myself. You never thought of me at all." Brent stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. The meek, compliant wife he'd taken for granted had vanished, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Since the beginning," I replied. "Since the night you brought her home. I heard your promises to her. I saw your emails. I watched you plan to discard me like I was nothing." Avalon's fury found a new target. She rounded on Brent, jabbing a manicured finger into his chest. "You've ruined everything. Do you have any idea what I've given up for you? The opportunities I've passed on? And now I find out you don't even control your own money?" "Avalon, please." Brent reached for her, but she shoved his hand away. "Don't touch me. You're pathetic. A sad old man who couldn't even manage to leave his wife properly." She turned to me, her pretty face ugly with hatred. "And you manipulative old witch. You let us plan. You pretended to be this helpless little housewife." "I didn't pretend anything," I said quietly. "You both saw what you wanted to see. You saw a woman you could push aside. You never bothered to look deeper." Brent sank onto the sofa, his face in his hands. "Myrtle, we need to talk about this. We can work something out." "Like what?" I asked. "Will you send her away? Go back to pretending you love me? Or are you still planning to cash out our life together to fund your midlife crisis?" Avalon gave a harsh laugh. "There's nothing to cash out, Brent. She owns everything." She grabbed her purse from the table where she'd flung it. "I'm not sticking around for this disaster. Call me when you've sorted out your mess and your money." "Avalon, wait." Brent scrambled to his feet, reaching for her. "Wait for what? More lies? More promises you can't keep?" She yanked her arm from his grasp. "I gave you everything, and you gave me nothing but humiliation." "That's not true," Brent protested. "I love you." "Love?" She spat the word like poison. "Love doesn't pay my bills. Love doesn't buy the life you promised me." She stalked to the door, pausing only to deliver a final blow. "You know what the worst part is? I actually started to care about you. What a waste." The door slammed behind her, leaving a vacuum of silence. Through the window, I watched her storm down the driveway, phone already pressed to her ear, calling. For a ride, no doubt. Brent stood frozen, staring at the closed door as if expecting Avalon to return. When he finally turned to me, his face had aged a decade in minutes. "She'll calm down," he said, his voice hollow with denial. Once she understands the situation, she'll come back. The situation? I echoed. You mean the fact that you tried to steal from me? That you brought your mistress into our home and expected me to serve her? That situation? It wasn't like that, he insisted. But his eyes couldn't meet mine. Then what was it like, Brent? Explain it to me. Help me understand how after 42 years, I became so worthless to you that you could treat me this way. He had no answer. He sank back onto the sofa, deflated, a man watching his carefully constructed fantasy crumble around him. I didn't mean to hurt you, he finally said, his voice small. A laugh escaped me, short, bitter, and entirely without humor. And yet, here we are. Outside, a car horn honked. Avalon appeared from the side of the house where she'd apparently been waiting, her phone still in hand. She climbed into a waiting Uber without a backward glance. Brent watched her go, devastation written across his features. I felt no satisfaction in his pain, only a profound weariness. This man who had shared my bed, my home, my life for over 4 decades was now a stranger to me. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood up, straightening my shoulders. Now, you pack your things. Eleanor will be sending over divorce papers tomorrow. You can stay at the Residence Inn until you find somewhere permanent. You're throwing me out? His eyes widened with genuine shock. After everything we've been through? No, Brent, I said, feeling suddenly much older than my 65 years. You threw us out weeks ago. You just didn't bother to tell me. 1 year. That's how long it took to dismantle 42 years of marriage. The divorce was finalized on a crisp autumn morning, much like the day Brent had first brought Avalon home. I signed the papers in Eleanor's office, my hand steady despite the weight of the moment. Eleanor had negotiated a settlement that even she called remarkably generous. I kept the house, the cabin, and most of our investments. Brent received enough to start over, which was more than he deserved, but less than he'd expected. Are you sure about this? Eleanor had asked when I instructed her on the terms. You could take everything. I don't want everything, I'd replied. I just want peace. And peace is what I found in the months that followed, though it came in unexpected ways. The first change I made was to my bedroom. I donated the king-sized bed where Brent and I had slept for decades and replaced it with a plush queen that was all mine. I painted the walls a soft seafoam green that Brent would have hated, but that made me smile every morning when I opened my eyes. The second change was to call Sarah and finally tell her everything. The conversation was long and painful, filled with her disbelief, anger, and eventually, tears. How could he do this to you? She'd asked, her voice breaking. To us? People change, I said, surprising myself with the lack of bitterness in my voice. Or maybe they don't change. Maybe they just finally show who they really are. Sarah flew home the following week, her husband and children in tow. Together, we purged the house of Avalon's improvements and many of the memories that no longer served me. We painted walls, rearranged furniture, and planted new flowers in the garden. My grandchildren's laughter filled rooms that had been silent for too long. Will you sell the house? Sarah asked as we sat on the porch swing, watching the children play in the yard. I considered the question, looking at the home where I'd spent most of my adult life. Not yet, I decided. It's mine now, truly mine. I want to live in it on my terms for a while. The third change was returning to school. I'd abandoned my education when I married Brent, setting aside dreams of becoming an art teacher to support his ambitions. Now, at 66, I enrolled in art classes at the local community college. My hands, weathered by decades of housework, remembered the joy of holding a paintbrush. My mind, so long occupied with Brent's needs and preferences, rediscovered the pleasure of creating for myself alone. 6 months after the divorce, I held my first small exhibition in the college gallery, landscapes of the lake by our cabin, rendered in oils and soft pastels. I invited friends, neighbors, even a few former clients of Brent's who had reached out after hearing about our split. To my surprise, people came. They admired my work. Some even bought pieces. I didn't invite Brent, but he came anyway. I spotted him at the back of the gallery, older and grayer than I remembered, watching me from a distance as I explained my technique to an interested couple. Our eyes met briefly across the room. He nodded once, something like respect in his gaze, then slipped away before I could decide whether to approach him. Later that night, Eleanor called to check on me. "How was the exhibition?" she asked. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it." "It was lovely," I said, curled up in my new reading nook by the fireplace. Brent showed up. A pause. "How did that feel?" I considered the question. "Like watching a movie about someone else's life," I finally replied. "I recognized the characters, but I didn't feel connected to the story anymore." Eleanor chuckled. "That's probably the healthiest response I've ever heard from a client." "I had a good lawyer," I teased, "and an even better friend." The conversation drifted to other topics: Eleanor's daughter's college applications, my upcoming trip to visit Sarah, the book club we'd both joined. Normal life, reassembling itself around the crater where my marriage had once been. The fourth, change was the hardest, learning to be alone without being lonely. After decades of organizing my days around Brent's schedule, his preferences, his needs, I had to discover my own rhythms. Some days I ate breakfast at noon. Some nights I stayed, up until dawn, painting or reading or simply sitting in the quiet of my home. I learned that I liked spicy food, which Brent had always refused to eat. I discovered a passion for foreign films, which he had dismissed as pretentious. Bit by bit, I uncovered the woman who had been buried beneath the role of Brent's wife. Almost, exactly 1 year after Avalon had arrived, I received a letter from Brent. The envelope sat on my hall table for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. "Myrtle," he wrote, his familiar handwriting more careful than I remembered. "I've started and abandoned this letter a dozen times. There's no adequate way to apologize for what I did to you, to us. I could blame a midlife crisis or fear of aging or a dozen other excuses, but the truth is simpler. I was selfish and cruel, to someone who deserved only kindness from me." The letter continued for 3 pages. Reflections on our marriage, acknowledgement of his betrayal, updates on his new, smaller life in an apartment across town. He was working part-time at a friend's accounting firm. He'd started therapy. He'd reconnected with his brother after years of estrangement. "I don't expect forgiveness," he concluded. "I don't even expect a response. But I wanted you to know that I see you now, truly see you, in a way I failed to do for too many years. The strength and dignity with which you handled my betrayal humbles me daily. I hope you're finding happiness on your own terms. You deserve nothing less." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't respond, but I didn't throw it away either. Some wounds heal best when left alone. That spring, I decided to host a garden party for my newly formed circle of friends, women I'd met through art classes, book clubs, and volunteer work at the local library. Most were my age or older, many, divorced or widowed, all of them vibrant and engaged with life in ways that inspired me. We gathered on the patio I'd redesigned, sipping wine and sharing stories as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Looking around at these women, my friends, my chosen family, I felt a profound sense of peace. "To new beginnings," said Claire, a retired nurse who had become one of my closest confidants, raising her glass in a toast. "And to old wisdom," I added, clinking my glass against hers. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Claire lingered to help me clear the dishes. "You seem happy, Myrtle," she observed, loading the dishwasher in the efficient way she'd taught. Me, so different from how Brent had always insisted it should be done. "I am," I replied, somewhat surprised by the simple truth of it. "No regrets?" she asked, eyebrow raised. I thought about the question, about the path that had brought me here, about the humiliation of those weeks with Avalon, about the pain of Brent's betrayal, about the fear and uncertainty of starting over at 65. No regrets, I decided. Just gratitude. For what? I smiled, thinking of the moment when Walter had revealed to Brent and Avalon that all the assets were in my name. That unexpected twist of fate that had given me back my power, my voice, my life. For second chances, I said. And for remembering that I was always stronger than I thought. That night, I stood in my garden as darkness fell, listening to the crickets and watching fireflies dance among the flowers I'd planted with my own hands. My house, my home, glowed warmly behind me, filled with new memories and possibilities rather than ghosts. 42 years I had given to Brent. Now, whatever years remained were mine alone, to spend, to cherish, to live on my own terms. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.